Gun Barrel Passage Rescue. In January of 1970, 31 adventurers gathered beneath a harsh winter sky, their breath fogging the frozen air as snow crunched beneath their boots. They were heading toward Knox Cave, a place already whispered about among cavers for one infamous feature known simply as the gun barrel. The gun barrel was no ordinary passage. Shaped like a narrow keyhole, it measured barely 18 inches across and stretched for nearly 60 feet. To enter it meant pressing your body into stone, inch by inch, with no room for error. For many, passing through was more than exploration. It was a rite of passage, a trial that tested courage, patience, and the ability to stay calm when the earth itself seemed to close in. Most of the group was determined to push beyond this constriction and reach untouched chambers hidden deeper within the cave. After trekking through a forest buried in snow, they arrived at the entrance, an icy sinkhole leading down into darkness. One at a time, they descended, leaving daylight behind as the cold intensified with every step. Inside, the cave felt oppressive. Water dripped steadily in the distance, boots scraped softly against rock, and sound seemed to vanish into the stone. 19 people chose to attempt the gun barrel. Among them 14-year-old Peter Van. It was Peter's first time caving, and he was eager to prove that he belonged. He watched others enter before him, some sliding through with confidence, others pausing, cautious and deliberate. When his turn came, Peter drew in a deep breath and pushed forward. The tunnel was far tighter than he had expected. Jagged rock scraped against his body as he worked his way ahead using elbows and knees. The air felt thin, his breathing grew shallow, and every few feet he had to stop, pinned beneath the weight of the stone above him. Just 8 feet from the exit, everything went wrong. As Peter shifted forward, his knee slipped into a narrow crack in the cave floor. At first, it seemed like a small problem, but when he tried to pull it free, it wouldn't move. Panic flooded in. He twisted and pulled harder, yet each attempt only wedged him deeper. His knee was locked in place. Peter shouted for help, his voice trembling, but the cavers ahead continued moving, unaware of what had happened. Slowly, one by one, they realized something was wrong. When they turned back, they found Peter trapped, blocking the tunnel completely. No one could move forward, no one could retreat. The gun barrel had become a dead end. They tried everything, pulling his leg, adjusting his position, shifting his body in the tight space. Each effort ended with Peter crying out in pain. Eventually, they were forced to stop. Time stretched on inside the narrow, freezing passage. The temperature dropped further, and hypothermia became a real danger. The group huddled together, exhausted and frightened, trying to preserve what warmth they could. Outside the cave, concern began to grow. The others had been gone too long. One person entered the cave to investigate, and when he reached the gun barrel, the sight stopped him cold. Peter trapped, the entire group immobilized behind him. He rushed back to the surface to raise the alarm. By late afternoon, police officers and firefighters arrived. Almost immediately, they understood the seriousness of the situation. This was not a standard rescue. The tightness of the gun barrel made brute force impossible, and any sudden movement could cause severe injury. Hours passed with little progress. Peter, weakened by cold and fear, began hallucinating, screaming that a snake was biting him. There was no snake, only the mind unraveling under darkness and exhaustion. As night fell, the danger escalated. The cave temperature had dropped to a critical level, threatening everyone trapped inside. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., after many failed attempts, rescuers came up with a new idea. A thermos filled with soapy water was passed into the cave, intended to lubricate Peter's knee and loosen it from the rock. Carefully, the liquid was poured around his leg while firefighters secured a rope around his ankle. Everyone moved in coordination. Those inside adjusted their positions to relieve pressure, while rescuers pulled slowly from outside. Inch by inch, the knee began to shift. Then, with one final, controlled pull, it slipped free. Relief washed through the tunnel, but the danger wasn't over. They had to ensure Peter didn't slide back into the crevice. With extreme care, they guided him through the remaining distance until he was completely clear. One by one, the others crawled out behind him, drained, shaken, but alive. Peter suffered fractures, bruising, and hypothermia. He was treated immediately and spent several days in the hospital while his leg healed. The gun barrel remained behind, silent, narrow, and unforgiving, a reminder that some passages are not merely physical, but trials of fear, endurance, and the will to keep going when there seems to be no way forward. Red Knolls Cave Rescue. On the night of December 21, 1997, cold air settled over the Arizona desert as 5 young men, Brandon Silverhorn, Christopher Reed, Gus Hansen, John Salazar, and Jeremy Platt, headed toward the Safford Shafts, a barren stretch of land better known as Red Knolls. It was not a place people visited casually. The terrain was scarred with deep vertical pits, many dropping 40 to 60 feet into the hardened remains of an ancient long-dried lakebed. One pit in particular stood out. It was sealed by a massive slab of rock nearly 4 feet thick, resting atop 60 feet of compacted silt. The setting felt hostile and unnatural, yet that danger was exactly what drew them there. They weren't looking for safety, they were chasing adrenaline. They arrived around 9 p.m., carrying gasoline and an unchecked sense of excitement. Surrounded by steep drops and looming rock walls, their attention locked onto a narrow fracture in the stone, barely a foot wide. An impulsive idea took hold, turned the crack into a burst of fire. Without pausing to reconsider, they poured 4 full gallons of gasoline into the opening. 4 gallons. One of them lit a rag, tossed it into the crevice, and stepped back. For a brief moment, there was nothing. Then the earth detonated. The ground tore open as fire and shattered rock blasted upward, the narrow fissure exploding into a yawning hole. The force of the blast hurled 4 of the men backward. They were battered and bleeding but alive. Brandon Silverhorn wasn't as lucky. He had been standing too close, leaning over the crack when the explosion erupted. The rock beneath his feet collapsed, and he vanished instantly, plunging roughly 40 feet straight down into the pit. He struck hard. His leg took the impact first, snapping violently before his body continued tumbling downward, chased by falling dirt and stone. Before he could react, a massive slab of rock, roughly 3 by 5 feet, slid loose from above and slammed down on him. Brandon was pinned beneath it, his body twisted at a grotesque angle. His head was forced sideways against the stone, his broken leg screaming in pain. Crushing pressure bore down on his abdomen and kidneys, turning each breath into torture. Dust flooded his lungs, stealing his voice before he could cry out. Above him, his friends screamed his name, but there was only silence in return. Panic erupted. They couldn't see him through the darkness and swirling debris. There was no way to free him themselves. Terrified and helpless, they sprinted back to their car and raced to town for help. Rescue teams arrived within an hour. One glance told them the truth. This would be a long, dangerous operation. The slab trapping Brandon wasn't merely heavy. It was wedged deep, nearly fused with the surrounding earth. The slanted angle of the crevice made every movement treacherous. One wrong shift could trigger another collapse. Below, Brandon hovered at the edge of consciousness. His leg was shattered, his chest compressed, his breathing shallow and strained. The cold seeped into his body, draining heat and strength as hypothermia set in. Time dragged on. The first obstacle was the slab itself. Rescuers used chisels to loosen its edges, working with agonizing care. Each strike sent fresh debris sliding down, turning every second into a calculated risk. Above the pit, a pulley system was assembled, ropes anchored to bolts drilled into solid rock. 6 men pulled with everything they had, lifting the slab inch by inch. Finally, with one final surge of effort, they shifted it aside. Then came the digging. Dirt and rock were removed slowly, deliberately, each movement measured to prevent another collapse. Below them, Brandon remained silent. Dust coated his throat, making even a whisper impossible. His mind drifted in and out, suspended between holding on and letting go. After hours of relentless work, the rescuers reached him. Astonishingly, he was still alive. By any reasonable measure, the weight, the injuries, the lack of air, he should not have been. Yet he was breathing, barely. The final challenge was getting him out. A harness was carefully secured around his limp body, his shattered legs stabilized as much as possible. With extreme caution, the team began lifting him, inch by inch. No movement was rushed. Every pull was intentional. Every breath was held. After nearly 12 exhausting hours, Brandon emerged from the pit. His leg was grotesquely swollen and twisted. His face was pale beneath layers of dirt, drained of color. His body was ice cold, his breathing weak. He was rushed to the hospital where doctors discovered kidney failure, a broken leg, and severe hypothermia. That Brandon survived at all defied logic. His rescue remains nothing less than a miracle. Boy Scout Cave Rescue. On December 27, 2003, a winter afternoon in Florida led 8 Boy Scouts and 2 adult leaders toward Boy Scout Cave, a site known among local explorers for its tight crawl spaces and sudden, twisting turns. Among the boys were 15-year-old Michael Shiro and 16-year-old Javik Henderson, both driven by curiosity and the thrill of discovery. Despite its reputation for narrow passages, the cave was considered structurally sound, which gave the group confidence as they prepared to enter. Because the crawlways were too restrictive for their size, the counselors chose to remain outside near the entrance, allowing the boys to venture in on their own. Inside, the temperature dropped noticeably. Beams from 9 flashlights danced across damp stone walls, briefly illuminating the darkness before being swallowed again. The boys pushed farther inward, ignoring the heavy silence that seemed to press in from every direction. Roughly an hour into the exploration, they reached one of the cave's most challenging features, a section called the Hairpin Curve. The passage bent sharply, forming a tight angle, barely wide enough for a single person to squeeze through. Michael moved first, determined to lead the way, with Henderson close behind. But as Henderson attempted to twist his body around the bend, his progress stopped abruptly. He was wedged in place, unable to move forward or retreat. Fear took hold as his breathing became rapid and strained. Realizing Henderson was trapped, Michael crawled back to assist him. As Michael forced himself into the cramped space, rough limestone scraped their arms and shoulders, restricting movement even further. From the wider chamber behind them, the rest of the boys waited anxiously. Minutes turned into an hour as the two struggled without success. Henderson's body was contorted painfully inside the narrow turn, jagged rock digging into his ribs and hips. Every attempt to shift only increased the pressure. As time passed, the danger escalated, then everything worsened. Cold and exhaustion overtook Michael, and he suddenly collapsed. Henderson, still stuck, could do nothing but lie helpless in the darkness beside him. Henderson's shouts echoed down the passage, but the other boys were too frightened to approach. They could only watch, frozen by panic. Outside the cave, the counselors remained unaware of the unfolding emergency. It wasn't until several boys scrambled back to the entrance, shaken, breathless and terrified, that the truth finally came out. The counselors reacted immediately, putting out their campfire and calling 911. Rescue teams arrived swiftly, bringing specialized equipment and experienced personnel. Inside the cave, fear hung thick in the air. The boys huddled together, pale and shaking, struggling to grasp how serious the situation had become. Aware of the dangers posed by hypothermia and limited oxygen, rescuers moved quickly toward the trapped teens. When the team reached the hairpin curve, the scene was bleak. Henderson was conscious but weak, his skin cold and damp. Michael lay just beyond him, unresponsive and icy to the touch. The rescuers began their work carefully, chiseling away at the limestone to widen the constricted passage. The sound of metal striking rock echoed through the cave, amplifying the tension. After more than an hour of painstaking effort, Henderson was finally freed. As he was pulled from the narrow bend, he broke down in tears, his body stiff and shaking from cold and fear. Wrapped in a thermal blanket, he was guided through the twisting passages toward the surface. Once Henderson was safe, the rescuers turned their full attention to Michael, who remained unconscious. After nearly 2 exhausting hours, they managed to free Michael as well. His pulse was faint but present. He was secured in a harness and slowly carried through the cave, every movement deliberate. When they emerged into daylight, emergency medical teams rushed in to provide treatment. Michael was immediately treated for severe hypothermia. It took a full day before Michael regained consciousness. Against the odds, he survived, a reminder of how quickly adventure can turn into tragedy, and how close the line between the two can be.